Oh, they should be dense.
fudgy.
The more dense, the better.
Yeah, but I bet there's some other people, and the ones that I brought in were definitely on the cakey end of things. You didn't think so?
I wouldn't be on the cakey end. For brownies,
Oh,
I'll be
yeah.
on the dense side.
On the dense end.
Yeah.
But the brownie we had in class last time was, kind of not that different from this, right? I didn't. This is a chocolate pudding cake. And so that immediately also tells you there's this extra ingredient that's supposed to make it a little bit denser than compared to at the far end of it, right? Remember the lady's fingers that were almost like a cracker practically, and fresh ladies' fingers are soft, but they're very, very light and very airy. So all of that has to do with proportions of ingredients and the techniques you use as well. How you bake it, how long you bake it, and how you treat the ingredients as you put them together. Okay, so if we think about so we can think about individual recipes, but we can also think about. Oh, this is out of order or something. No, okay. Cookbooks. And so, what do you think cookbooks are going to show you that just individual recipes may not so much?
What do you mean?
Cookbooks. What is it? What are you going to learn from it? Yeah.
Maybe it'll show you a picture of the finished product.
A picture of the product. Yeah.
Some cookbooks will kind of give you like the history or the background of the dish.
Mm-hmm. So a little more information, maybe. What were you going to say?
It's normally like one, like certain types, like it's like Indian or Chinese, like it's kind of generally like focused on one category.
Some cookbooks have like pictures of every single step that you need to take, whereas others literally just list, what you're supposed to do. So the photos will make it easier for people that might not have ever worked with that type of food.
Yeah. So the combination of images and description and steps and measurements and all of that can go together. And then I think what you were hitting on with it's giving you, so it's not the same recipe repeated over and over again, right? So what is it giving you? A bunch of recipes. And what do you think that bunch of recipes can show you? Because think how much we got out of one recipe last class. What do you think a bunch of them are going to do? What are they going to tell you about? Go for it, Alan. The food available to them. Yeah, so the habits or practices or ideas that surround not just one food, but lots of different foods. So you can think of it in terms of how those foods go together, how those different preparations go together, and so forth. I'm going to run through a couple of examples so we can have a little bit more of a framework for thinking about cookbooks. One of them is looking at the beginnings of cookbooks in India, and particularly, this is Arjun Appadurai, who is a very well-known anthropologist who looks a lot at material culture, experiences, meaning, how we create meaning, and that sort of thing. And he did a little study of these cookbooks, and he was interested in ones that were published in English in India and when that happens, and sort of putting that within the history of cookbooks in general. And so for part of it, you can think about in this region largely Hindu practices that food is this common metaphor. So again, like we've been seeing in other cases, food is a way to examine or enact morality, right? You can eat things that are good for you. They're very, and what's going on in the Indian case that might be especially important in connection to food? Yeah. Cows, right. What about cows? So, yeah, hmm?
They really value cows.
Yeah. And they value them so much they just eat the whole thing?
But they don't even know.
They don't. Like it's a forbidden food. It's not just that it's a food, but to work with like so in India you have this social classification ranking system of the caste system, and so people who work in leather in particular, think of what you're doing. You're taking the skin off the cow and working with all of these fluids and things that are considered corrupting. And the people who do that are of the untouchable caste. Yet at the same time, they're doing this work that's tremendously important for the functioning of the whole society. So it's not like as you move through the different castes and their ranks that they're not needed in society or they become less important to the functioning of the whole. It's just that there are these moral values that are attached to each part. And so you have this sort of these moral issues, these medical issues, and as you move through different castes, different sorts of foods are associated with it. A little bit when I showed the caste system that emerged in the 18th century in Latin America, the castizaje, where certain foods were associated with certain people. So you have that going on. And what Pomeroy noticed is that these early Hindu texts, you have writing, very ancient writing, and of all kinds, but they talk about eating and feeding because it's crucially important, but nothing that would be like recipes or receipts like we were talking about last night. Very, very little about that. What he especially noticed too was that when you start to have something that could be thought of as a regional, widely, or almost a national cuisine of India, it's related to colonization and expansion of the Mughal Empire in the 16th century. And you have the first sort of manual, again, like last time when I showed Richard III's royal cookbook, his receipt, his recipes that they prepared for him. It's the same sort of thing, where you have in Hindu texts discussions of how to run the royal household in the Mughal Empire, and part of it is preparing food the right way. Very parallel. And so what India, in fact, is like, so they're not eating, before the 16th century, there's no way you could say they're all eating the same thing, that there's one thing that you could call Indian food. And from region to region, you have different languages, different cultural ethnic groups, and it's all this sort of really distinct array of ways of preparing the kinds of foods they eat. And then in the 19th century, what really happens is this big shift of more books available with popular printing, very cheap, easy printing of lots of books, and you have the emergence of these books on household management, and that's where you start to see some recipes creep in, and something sort of like cookbooks, but it's very much like what you see in English at the same time. Do I have an example with me today? Yeah, I do, kind of. Where these, have any of you looked at like those 19th century, like older household management or turn of the century, where it's not just, yeah, you can cook the food this way, you can make soap, you should arrange your household, these are good cleaners. I mean, it's everything about the house, and so food is part of that. You see the same sort of thing happening at about the same time in India. And then within that, this very general chronology, the first printed English printed in English cookbooks come out in the 1960s. And anybody have an idea of what might be going on at around this time in this region? Just sort of very generally. 1960s. Yeah, go for it.
British independence.
Yeah. Yeah. So remember the whole thing with the Belizean food and how it really changes with these movements towards independence and this valuing of regional cuisines rather than things that were more associated with the colonial powers. Here you have things being printed in English but of Indian food. So in regional Indian food. The other thing too, tremendous urbanization happening. Like people are moving into cities, living in cities. And what does that mean? People from all these different sub-regions are coming together in ways that they hadn't before. And what's their common language? Well, one of them is English, and so that it makes more sense to have, you know, he saw it fitting in within those sorts of social movements, the rise of a middle class, so an urban working middle class, and ways to socialize. And what else? Something else. I'm trying to remember. And yeah, and so this food, he saw, you know, you have offerings at restaurants and the growth of restaurants in the 50s, 60s, and later. And he saw a real parallel with what people served in restaurants as either sort of like a taste tour of different parts of India or particular regional cuisines. He saw those being very parallel, the dishes that you'd see there also in restaurants, in cookbooks. Which brings up a question. When you go to a local food, Midwestern restaurant, do they serve every possible dish that someone might prepare? No, right? So there's a selection process that happens. He was very interested in the kinds of choices people were making in the restaurants, and that they were highly, highly similar to what ends up in cookbooks too. It's the same kind of decision making going on. And so you can look at that as an anthropologist and think, well, what are they emphasizing? What about those places or that selection is telling us about what's happening socially? And then the other thing he emphasized, unlike, you know, and we're getting back into that sort of Mary Douglas of reproducing kin relationships with food. You know, you can taste something and you can try it, and it becomes part of you because it feeds your body. But it's also something you don't have to keep eating every day, right? You can leave it. You can eat part of it and not eat the whole thing. You get in a relationship with somebody, that's a much harder choice to reverse. And so he sees that in a very similar way to Mary Douglas as far as making these selections that are mirroring, you know, social interaction, but it's safe. It's a safe way to kind of try things out. So in general, yeah, this is the middle class that I was mentioning earlier, and that there are a lot more links among people by class rather than region. And so this exploring through cookbooks and through restaurants, the tastes of other people, gave a chance for sort of this interethnic interaction to happen. And more sorts of dining and experiences across these caste boundaries. And then the other thing that's going on, if you have an urban working class, a lot of them are women, right? And so some of these cookbooks are those sort of household guides in a way in how to be efficient with things. and how to save time or be more thrifty or do things in an acceptable way that helps the household run. And then finally, the other thing about the English cookbooks in particular, he found that a lot of them were aimed towards and had a large market outside of India. So they're being sold in India, but then they're also being sold in England and the United States and other places where people had immigrated to. And so he saw it as a way to know and feel connected at home, right? Yeah. And in fact, you see this sort of reliance on cookbooks for people who feel like they've lost an experience, lost that kind of, and this has been a theme in a few of the cooking technology books, where you don't have that sort of face-to-face chance to learn, and yet it's so connected to your identity. An example that comes to mind is of a friend who grew up during what was called the special period in Cuba. And during that time, it was very difficult to have enough food. I mean, access to anything was very, with trade embargoes and all sorts of other things going on, people were on the very edge of being able to feed themselves. And so she said her mom would never let her help cook because the chance of her wasting food, spilling something or burning something was too great. And she just couldn't sacrifice that chance that the food would get messed up and they wouldn't be able to eat it. And so someone gave her a Cuban cookbook for a gift, and she's like, I'm so glad to have this because I feel like I might be able to learn some of the things I never got to with my mom. So I think that's when he's talking about Indian expatriates. It's that same sense of recovering those lost moments through cookbooks. So that tells us too, if we can look at those cookbooks, we might be able to get a sense of what is being represented and what seems to be the most important. He saw a trend in these early, 60s, early 70s cookbooks of providing new ways of preparing things to deal with, a moral problem of contamination. So leftovers are an issue because saliva within Hindu moral values is contaminating. And so you can't have anything that has a chance of having somebody else's fluids, and serve it to somebody, you would be doing them a disservice. So this cookbook really deals with that up front. This is how you can manage your leftovers, this is what you can do with it, and this makes it, fully presentable and a new meal and good to do. How to reuse foods properly. Do y'all have any experience with leftover recipes? Yeah, Katie, what?
With my house, we're always cooking. So, just the other day, I made roast and a crock pot, and so I used some of the leftovers.
And my cousins were born in America, like me, but they would eat breakfast on top of the rest of the meals, and I was like, I can't eat this much during the day.
Yeah, and then the dinner itself, like the different dishes, if there's more than one dish, it's all at once.
Yeah.
It's not like.
It's like a big buffet.
Yeah, right. So you don't have a salad course and then a soup course. No, it's just out there. It's all served, and that's part of what's represented here. Is that you have all the elements, and that